Chapter 23 is World War II. In many ways, you can see World War II as being unfinished business from World War I. Partially the conflict of World War I, but also the peace settlement. But in another way, World War II is a positive demonstration, and the outcomes certainly reinforce this, of the changing nature of global power. Europe is no longer going to be the leading force in world politics. Instead, those power centers will move to different places, like Washington, D.C., Moscow, and even Beijing. But as you look at Chapter 23, the 3 points that you want to keep in mind. Number 1, America fighting a global war. Number 2, mobilizing the home front. And number 3, the transition from global war to global leadership. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, wasn't so much a surprise to Americans that it came, but rather where it came. With hostilities in Europe dating back to 1939, and in Asia dating back as far as 1937, the Americans knew that it was a dangerous world and that the Japanese were aggressive, and that the risk of attack would come at any moment. But we assumed it would be in the Philippines. Instead, the attack on Pearl Harbor catches the fleet really asleep, and is a devastating defeat for the Americans, wiping out the strike force of the big battleships. But it brings the Americans into a war that probably it was going to get into one way or another anyhow. The Americans are now engaged, especially as Adolf Hitler declares war on December 8th, in a global conflict. Even though it was Japan and not Germany that had bombed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, the U.S., along with its British and Russian allies, adopted a Europe-first strategy, seeing Adolf Hitler as the more dangerous of the two enemies. The culmination of this strategy then took place in June of 1944 with the famous Normandy or D-Day landings. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed ashore in France and began the march eastward across Western Europe. At the same time, the Russians began marching from the east in hopes of isolating Germany in the middle and knocking them out of the war. At the same time this was going on, all the way on the other side of the world, the United States, again with British and Australian allies, were island hopping their way across the Central Pacific in hopes of isolating and eventually defeating the Japanese. In every theater, though, this was definitely an Allied effort. The Battleship Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor is one of the most moving monuments in the United States, and rightly so. What you see here are droplets of oil that are still escaping from the stricken ship today, and will continue to for years to come. These drops of oil serve as a reminder to us of the attack that happened on December 7th, but also of the entire war that followed, and the fact that the world we live in today is filled with the legacies of World War II. Visible memorials in monuments and cemeteries across the globe remind us of the cost of the war and the legacies that it's left behind, political, economic, and social. But as you read Chapter 23 and study World War II and America's role in it, keep these things in mind. Number 1, America fights a truly global war. Number 2, America had to mobilize the home front to fight this war. And number 3, at the end of it, America transitioned from a global war to global leadership. So long. I'll see you for Chapter 20.